What if faith isn't proven in comfort, those moments when we're comfortable, when everything's going well, but instead in confrontation? What if true devotion to Jesus means being willing to walk straight into the systems that need overturning with courage and clarity and compassion? What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putthoff, and this is scene 21 of the JesusX30 challenge. 30-day discipleship challenge. We're following my 3-volume project, Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 books are now out. They're in print and they're in ebook. Go check them out wherever you buy your books. Follow along. This week in Matthew 21 and 22, 23, Mark 11 to 13, and Luke 19 to 21. So in this scene, we're looking at Matthew 21 to 23, Mark 11 to 13, and Luke 19 to 21. And we find ourselves right up against Jesus's third and final Passover. And everything at this point really starts to slow down in the narrative. What used to be months between one paragraph to the next in the Gospels becomes hours that take up a single page in the Gospels. Jesus is not avoiding danger anymore. We've started to see the way he's turned his campaign from gathering steam and gathering momentum. And at this point, he's really starting to face his opponents head on. And by now, he's marching straight into Jerusalem, knowing full well what waits for him on Passover of 29 AD. As he approaches Jerusalem from Bethany, he arranges what we call the Triumphal Entry. We all know this. We celebrate it on Palm Sunday. It's the Sunday before Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection on Easter. And we call this the Triumphal Entry, but this really isn't just a parade like a lot of us, I think, picture. This is a protest. So Jesus is not riding on a war horse, but on a donkey. And this is deliberate. This is a fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9. And it literally says this: see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey. So this is a protest, because anyone would have understood that what Jesus was doing here was claiming to be the rightful king of God's people and of God's nation. And so any of the leaders on board, they would have seen Jesus coming in on a donkey and thought, this dude is trying to usurp our throne, to overthrow the leadership. And by now, they've already plotted and started to arrange his assassination. But this just puts the icing on the cake for them. And the crowd is shouting, Hosanna, which literally means save us now. They're waving palm branches in the air. This is thick with this patriotism and nationalism, and they're expecting Jesus to march into Jerusalem at this point and launch his actual revolt against the leadership and against the Roman authorities. And Jesus embraces he understands that he truly is the rightful king. He does deserve to sit on the true throne of God's people and of the cosmos. But he takes all of this and he subverts their meaning. He's not coming in to conquer Rome. He's coming in to expose and redeem the very idea of power itself. So his first stop isn't the palace. He doesn't go into Herod's palace and say, hey, I'm here to take you on. He goes to the temple. And that's where he starts to flip the tables again, as he did at the beginning of his public campaign. Remember in John 2? And this time he's quoting Isaiah and Jeremiah, and he's saying things like, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. And this isn't just about corruption in money changing. We talked about that at the start of Jesus's campaign when he did this the first time. So you've got to understand, in ancient thinking, the temple symbolized the order of the cosmos, moral order, economic order, political order, social order, religious order. It wasn't like a church today where we utilize that space to worship and then we go home. It was everything. It meant everything. There's ancient Jewish writings that literally call the temple the omphalos, the belly button, the navel of the world. It's the center point of all of heaven and earth. And it's literally the meeting point where heaven and earth collide. So by disrupting its economy, the temple's economy, Jesus is actually declaring that the system meant to connect people to God has become a machine that blocks them instead. Okay, he's not just criticizing having a Starbucks in your church. He's not criticizing selling merch in your church. What he's criticizing is the way this temple system has become an economic barrier for those who can't afford to worship. They can't afford to pay what's being demanded of them so that they're able to offer the proper sacrifices and participate in the sacrificial proceedings. And at the end of the day, if they can't participate in those sacrificial proceedings, they can't encounter God the way God designed the temple to be. And so Jesus is coming along and he's saying, you've made this into a den of thieves. You're robbing people when I intended this to be a house in which all people, all nations, my people and all the other nations in the world could come and encounter me directly through prayer, through worship, through fellowship. It's prophetic theater that Jesus is putting on, and everyone understands it. And the authorities, they've already begun plotting his death, and they really take it up a notch after this. So on his way back into the city the next morning, Jesus goes out and it's a strange moment. He goes out and he curses a fig tree, Mark 11. And the fig tree is healthy, but there's no fruit on it. Jesus is making a prophetic symbolic declaration. So if you understand what the prophets did a lot of times in the Old Testament, is God would give them a message and they would go out and enact it. Ezekiel would eat a scroll, or one of the prophets might lie on their side for a long duration of time, and they would enact the message that God wanted them to communicate to the people. Rather than just come out and say the words, they would do something symbolic to make the point even stronger. And so Jesus right here, he's critiquing, he's condemning this fig tree randomly, but the symbolism, it's not a subtle symbolic gesture. So the leadership of God's people at this time, like that tree, Jesus is communicating, looks impressive, but it fails to nourish its people. So it's a symbolic declaration that corresponds to what he just did in the temple. And he's exposing the appearance, the flashy appearance, saying we believe in God, we represent God, using cliche terms and actions to make it look like they were God's representatives and they were on the right side. But at the end of the day, it was appearance without substance. It was performance without true belief and transformation. So for the next few days, Jesus teaches in the temple courts. And I'm sure he's got his disciples keeping an eye out for him. I'm sure he's looking over his shoulder because he knows the heat is on him at this point. But he continues to teach publicly and he continues to press his message out, even up until his final days before his crucifixion. And so each conversation is a battle of wits with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians, who weren't friends otherwise, but who came together because they singly hated Jesus. And so Jesus is doing these social games against them where they would confront each other in public and try to make the other one look bad and shame the other and make them lose followers and weaken his platform. He wins all of these matches. He continues to heap shame on them for trying to confront him and subvert what he's trying to do in his movement. And they're trying to trap him with questions about taxes, about resurrection, legal puzzles, and every answer Jesus gives completely flips the categories that through which they view the world. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God's. That's not about dual loyalty. It's a challenge to recognize that basically everything already belongs to God. When asked the greatest commandment, he basically distills the entire law into two sentences: love God, love neighbor. It's simple, it's profound, but it's radical enough to be a motto, a mission statement for the entire movement that he's starting. And then there's a really haunting scene that we find in Mark 12. So this is the story of the widow's mite. So Jesus goes in Mark 12 before he enters the temple courts, and he makes a statement, and he says, he basically denounces the scribes who, quote, devour widows' houses, end quote. So he comes after the leadership, and he basically says, you are rotten because you devour widows' houses. And you've got to understand, a widow in Jesus's day didn't have any protections. If she didn't have family to take care of her, or someone in her community to take her on as a charity case, she had nothing. She was just living the rest of her life. She didn't have any way to take care of herself or protect herself. And Jesus understood that, and he said, you've created a system that devours widows' houses. You rob them, and it's all in the name of God. It's all in the name of, we have a good economy that God has blessed. And so Jesus makes this declaration. And then in the next scene in Mark 20, we find him sitting in the temple courts, in the treasury, and he's watching people drop their coins into the big, large copper bins. And he sees all of these wealthy people come up and make a show of it, right? They throw their coins into these bins, their trumpet shaped lips, and it's making a noise, and everybody knows how much you put in by how loud it was, or how little you put in by how quiet it was. And they're all celebrating each other for how much they're tithing. And Jesus sees all of that. And then all of a sudden he sees a widow walk up, and she has two copper coins. That's all she has. And the text literally says she gave everything she had, all of her life. It doesn't say anything about money necessarily, the way the text describes her gift, her offering. It describes her well-being. She's giving the last of everything she has. And so Jesus calls attention to this gift. And he's not calling attention to it in the way that a lot of us do. We celebrate the widow's gift because of her sacrifice, her faithfulness, her loyalty to God, her willingness to give even when she didn't have any. And Jesus understands that, and he's celebrating her for that. But he's also pointing out the great injustice of a system that has put this poor widow in a situation where she has nothing left to give except literally the two coins that she had to live on the rest of her life. And so Jesus is not just celebrating her, he's condemning those who have put her in this situation by failing to enact policies that help widows like her, welfare programs, we would call them in our day, and by failing to embrace the scriptures all throughout the Hebrew Bible that describe a God who favors those who can't take care of themselves. There is nothing in the Bible that says God takes care of those who help themselves. There are hundreds of places in Scripture where God declares that He always sides with those who can't help themselves. Doesn't ask questions. Bad decisions, good decisions, whatever has gotten him in that situation, doesn't matter. He always sides with those who can't help themselves, including this woman. And that's why right before this, Jesus condemns those who have put this type of a person in this situation. And then he goes and he sees her deposit her coins, and he says, look, she's given the rest of her life. It's a social critique. The very institution, the very people claiming to serve God have created conditions where even the poorest must sacrifice everything just to belong in the temple courts, just to encounter God. So this episode is what we would call a sandwich, a Markan sandwich. You've got the condemnation of those who devour widows' houses. You've got the story of the widow giving her last two coins, everything she has to live on. And then as they're leaving, you have the other side of this sandwich, the other bun. So as they're leaving the temple, this is all in Mark 13, the disciples are looking around and they're like, man, teacher, look at what massive stones. Look how incredible this is. And this is where Jesus goes into in Mark 13, kind of a declaration of judgment. And specifically, he turns to them and says, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but not one stone will be left on another in Mark 13:2. Okay, we all read that as Christians in the 21st century, and we say, oh, that Jesus is shifting to some end time prediction. He's not. He's literally speaking about the moment that they're in right now. He's talking to the disciples and he says, hey, something is about to happen where not one stone will be left on another of this temple. And all of that came to fruition. That prophetic critique that Jesus waged right there in Mark 13 actually happened in 70 AD when Rome came and destroyed the temple and razed it to the ground. And so he's tying the destruction to the way people, even God's people, mistreat those who are vulnerable. And I think this is an incredible and an important lesson that we need to understand. One, stop jumping to conclusions and assuming that anytime Jesus says something related to judgment or future judgment, it has to do with us. This has to do with what Jesus was dealing with at the moment and what Jesus knew was about to happen in the next generation in 70 AD. And two, I think we need to understand that Jesus, like the God of the Old Testament, who's often depicted wrongly as angry and vengeful and vindictive, Jesus and God never get angry at those who need their help. Jesus and God in the Gospels and in the Old Testament, all throughout, only judge those, whether it's their nation or another nation, who enact policies that make it impossible for those who are suffering, those who are struggling, those who are downtrodden to rise up and take care of themselves. Jesus is condemning a system that has put a person like this widow in a spot where she has to choose, do I eat tomorrow or do I tithe to God? Because in his mind, you should be able to do both. It's a human right. And he understands that. So he declares judgment. It's a Markan sandwich. He declares judgment before and after, and then the enacted kind of parable of the account is him sitting with his disciples watching this widow give her last 2 coins, everything she has. And here's where I think this, hits home for us. So every generation faces its own temple moment. Those times when the systems, the economy, the politicians, the social systems that we've trusted, they start to reveal their cracks. Maybe it's a church culture that prizes appearance over authenticity, a workplace that rewards self-promotion over service, or this inner pattern, that inner voice inside of us that values control over surrender. I don't know what it is. The invitation is the same, no matter what the case. Don't just admire Jesus overturning tables. Let him overturn the ones inside of you. Let him subvert everything you think and hold dearly. This is what we might think of this as reframing. So choosing response over reaction, purpose over panic. That's exactly what Jesus is modeling here. He walks into conflict fully conscious. He's never unaware of what's going around him. And I think it's a good demonstration for us that faith, that following Jesus at its best, like Jesus demonstrates, isn't about avoiding the tension. And it's not about putting our blinders on and walking through life without taking note of what's going on around us. It's not about hiding and removing our kids from the public sphere and working from home and hiding in our bunkers and waiting for Jesus to return based on a text like Mark 13 that has nothing to do with the end times to begin with. It's about going out and experiencing the good and the bad of life and reframing the way we encounter it. Rather than walk around with judgment of the widow, why don't we think of it through a new lens? Why don't we think of it through the lens of how would Jesus respond in this moment? The question we might ask ourselves, when Jesus walks into my space, spaces of pride, performance, fear, am I going to let him turn things over? Am I going to let him really get in there and expose the systems that I hold dearly that either keep someone else down or are holding me down as well. I think that's where renewal begins. Lekul Mod, go and learn. Come back for scene 22 of the Jesus X30 challenge.